come and talk about political science and the internet. And nobody had ever asked me to talk about political science and the internet. I challenge you to identify for me anybody from the political science side of the universities that actually works on internet governance issues. I think if you did a poll of political scientists, they would say, what? Governance? Internet? How are they related? So I thought that was a pretty big challenge. It's also a big challenge because even though I have a PhD in political science, I always tell people I've got a PhD in government because political science sounds like such bullshit. I mean, how can there be a science of politics? And you know, when you think about science, you think about laboratories and people in white coats and theories and theorems and equations. And yeah, we do some of that in political science, but I think basically it gets back to the original meaning of the word science. Science not only collects facts, but it tries to link those facts together in ways that you understand more about something. And so I want to approach the internet in that particular context because I think, frankly, and you've heard me say it a number of times since we've gotten together, that I think there is a lot of conceptual confusion when we talk about internet governance. And really, the beginning of being able to deal effectively with a problem is first to be able to define and understand that. So I'm going to take you through, since, how many of you have ever taken a course in political science? There you go. So we have some smart people in the room, okay? I'm going to go through kind of political science 101 for about 10 or 15 minutes, just to kind of talk to you a little bit about what we're going to talk about. Because I think if you don't have that background and you don't have some of the basic principles, it's pretty hard then to think coherently and conceptually about the issue of internet governance. Now, I told Kilnam this is going to be a different kind of lecture, and I'm delighted that Adam and Pablo and others spoke before me, because hopefully now you have the background, you have the history, you have what we call the nomenclature, or the language that people use to talk about internet governance. Now I want you to take all that together and learn how to think about internet governance. And I think we need to think about it because I'm not sure we know what we're talking about at this stage. I'm not even sure I know myself. But as Adam said, we're at a point, we're kind of at an inflection point. You might want to argue that Net Mundial was the peak, even though WSIS and the UN process came after that, giving it an extra 10 years. I was just talking to Amrita and I said, you know, the extra 10 years doesn't mean anything about internet governance. It was just simply because the governments couldn't decide what they want to do about the internet. So why not give it another 10 years? So that's both a problem, but I think as Adam has framed it, particularly in the wake of Net Mundial, and the sad experience that has come of not being able to build on the Net Mundial achievements, and the achievements are huge. I think that statement that Adam put together, you know, will continue to be read. It'll be more than just part of the historical record. It'll continue to be read as a reflection of how people are learning to think about how we manage our affairs on the internet. So, and very, very important. But the question is, I think we're at an inflection point where we either got to get more serious about this or understand that there are going to be consequences for our failure to take action. If only because many countries now are beginning to understand the internet is too important to leave up to the people in this room. It's at the center of their societies, it's at the center of their economies, it's at the center of their political systems, and national cyber sovereignty is a form of internet governance. And actually, quite frankly, all things being equal, it's the one that's going to win. Even though I think a very powerful argument can be made that if it wins, we all lose. But the question is, how do we stop from losing? So I want to talk a little bit about political science first, and then we're going to enter a period where I hope that we can have a real discussion about some of these issues. And I'm going to turn the tables on you. Normally, when the lecturer finishes their half hour or 45 minutes, they kind of say, any questions? And I hate to do that because, first of all, the questions sometimes are not all that good. Other times, they're not all that answerable. And you never really get back to the heart of the matter. So the last part of this discussion is going to be me asking you questions. And I'm going to put you on the spot. So I suggest you close your laptops now, because if you're not paying attention, you're going to have a small moment of embarrassment. I don't mind embarrassing you. I'll embarrass myself. Okay. So let's get started. What is political science? Well, pretty simple. We study political institutions. We study parties. We study bureaucracies, how they operate, how they grow, how they change. We study political behavior, elections, public opinion. And actually, people say, do you guys have any science? Well, you know, the science of public opinion polling, the science of predicting elections is actually pretty good. I think somebody asked me here, when will we know the results of the U.S. election? Will it be several days after the vote? I said, no, we'll probably even know before the polls are closed. There's a 3-hour time difference between the East Coast and the West Coast, and they'll be calling elections on the East Coast before they even finish voting on the West Coast. It's that quick. And the reason is because that people vote in predictable ways. If you tell me who your mother and father is, if you tell me where you live, if you tell me where you went to school, I can probably predict who you're going to vote for. Not always, but with a considerable degree of certainty. Why? Because it's that environment that socializes you into a set of political opinions that connects you with a political party. We're going to talk about political ideology, democracy, and dictatorships. You know, there's a lot of talk about democracy. I've noticed that. But the fact is that most of the world is still a dictatorship. Democracy actually is on the retreat. It's not on the rise. And so the notion that somehow that the internet is going to be different and be democratic is pretty much a stretch, I think. And then finally, we're going to get down, this is what people never understand. Politics is about power. And people win and people lose. People live and people die. I was a diplomat for 25 years. Great definition of a diplomat. A diplomat is an honorable person, myself being that, set abroad by their country to lie on its behalf. I never found any personal kind of ethical issues between looking somebody straight in the face from another country and telling a lie. That's my job. My job is to advance the interests of your country. And it's a zero-sum game in many, many circumstances. How do you win zero-sum games? That's what politics is all about. Okay, so that's political science. Okay, now, we're going to start off in 400 BC. That's where we're going to learn about the internet. This guy called Aristotle, Greek political philosopher, kind of the guy who created political science. And he was a smart guy, and he said, you know, basically there's 6 different ways of organizing your government, or 6 different ways of organizing internet governance. Governments are all the same. You can have a monarchy, you can have an aristocracy, a polity, a tyranny, an oligarchy, or the rule of all. And the rule of all means, of course, the rule of none. And I gave you some practical examples. I'm not going to go into too much depth. Polity is probably the one that you're least familiar with. That's where a small group of elites dominate politics, but are connected through institutions and organizations with larger groups. The British Conservative Party is a agglomeration of different kinds of commercial, agricultural and social interests. The Labour Party, labor unions are very, very important, but so are civil society groups, a wide variety of different groups with progressive ideas. I mean, and interests are not just your economic interests. In fact, what motivates most of you is not economics, it's a certain set of political beliefs. Tyranny, I don't think... Aristocracy and oligarchy are a little bit different. Aristocracy kind of is a group of elites, and maybe I'm exaggerating in Japan, that through their education, through their personal achievements, have achieved positions of authority and respect in society, and are the ones basically, whether as bureaucrats or as leaders of industry or leaders of key social groups, basically organize society. Oligarchy in China is basically a smaller group, often tied in with one particular large organization, in this case the Communist Party, but however that perpetuates itself over time through family connections. In other words, if your father was a member of Mao's army, your grandson today is probably in the party elite running a local province. In other words, it perpetuates itself over time. And Aristotle divided up governments. These were ones that he thought were functional. These were ones that he thought were dangerous. So, we're going to get to a point where I'm going to ask you, where internet governance and some of these things we talk about on the internet fit into this thing. Okay, there's been a lot of thinking subsequently about political theory, but I want to jump to the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And again, most of you have probably never heard of these things, but I put this up just to be provocative. There was a English political theorist called Thomas Hobbes, wrote a book called Leviathan, which means, the great state. And he was very, very concerned because his personal experience was during a time of almost perpetual civil war in England, where families fought against families, a lot of treachery. And he absorbed from that the natural state of human relations is incredibly dangerous. That basically everybody is out for themselves, and it's the war of all against all. And the only way for people to have a decent life, for their children, for themselves, to feel secure, sort of like the internet, isn't it? Feel secure is to cede power to an authority. And he called that authority Leviathan, or civil society. He said you have to create civil society. But civil society was not a group, as in this room, of people organized around a set of political beliefs. Civil society was basically creating a state. In other words, he said, unless you create a government that can exercise authority and provide people with what they most want of all, is to be safe. They don't mind even if they're hungry and thirsty, as long as they're alive. So, if you're thinking about Syria, Syria is looking for civil society. But I don't think any of you want to go and help them. They're looking for a strong person to come in there and reorganize the society, because as bad as Assad was, or in the case of Iraq, as bad as Saddam Hussein was, I think if you had a vote today, 100% of the people would support them, because at least he allowed you to feel safe. Okay, so that's civil society. Now what about multi-stakeholder? Is there anything in political science that talks about multi-stakeholder? And actually there is. John Locke, actually a guy who inspired a lot of very original political thinking in America, said that, the way to organize society is not just to have a strong state, because that often leads to abuses. What you need to have is a state that provides opportunities for people with a stake in it, with an interest in it, to take leadership of society. And he defined that as people who owned property. And people don't realize it, but originally in the United States, voting was limited to people that had property. It was the same in Japan. I suspect it was maybe the same in India at one point in time. The notion that everybody, as a human being, had a vote just didn't occur to anybody. You had to have a stake in the society. So he talked about a multi-stakeholder kind of arrangement. He talked about property people coming together and creating a social contract, a set of rules by which they would live together. So that, kind of similar. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a French philosopher, greatly influenced the course of the French Revolution. And I liked him because he talked about the fact that man was most free in the state of nature. So completely opposite from Hobbes. And said that, when society put on rules and regulations, man became changed, and actually that provoked conflict more than just simply living in nature and accepting the bounty and the fruits of nature. And you sometimes hear that on the internet. The internet should be free. We don't need to have governments. We don't need to have companies. We don't need to have filtering devices or security and things like that. The internet needs to be free. Only problem with that is that even Rousseau acknowledged that there were times when there were certain bad things that were happening even in nature. And so the society would need to get together and sort of decide among themselves what would be a consensus way of dealing with an issue. And they called it the general will. And you say, well, that sounds great. Everybody gets together and they talk about things and they decide it. But inevitably, in that particular society, there's no respect for human rights. There's no fundamental freedoms. There's no kind of fundamental appreciation of the value of the individual. It's kind of the group that prevails. And always in a group, hierarchy develops. So actually, the very kind of contradictory sort of thing that developed is that Jean-Jacques Rousseau is looked upon by many people as the original thinker about a totalitarian society. In other words, where Big Brother or the state actually organizes activities for you. And in many ways, whether you're looking at social media or you're just simply looking at the pervasiveness of government surveillance of the internet, aren't we a little bit concerned that this great internet, which allows us to be free and operate in the state of nature, also provides a vector for controlling our lives? By learning about us, using our privacy, destroying our security, and leaving us open to control by the government in every form. As you know, we'll leave that aside for the moment. Then finally, classical versus modern liberalism and the role of government. This is also a big debate. Classical liberalism says the state that governs best regulates least. You've heard that many times about the internet. Modern liberalism says, whoa, wait a minute. That just means that the big boys get the seat at the table. What about the rest of us? Government has a responsibility to provide basic human needs, whether it's education or whether it's health care, whether it's access to the internet, whether it's protection of minorities. So there's a real debate that goes on. So kind of amazing, isn't it, that the debates that we're having about the internet actually kind of mirrored a lot of the things that were happening in the 17th and 18th and 19th century. It goes on. I know some people are going to feel a little bit uncomfortable about this, but if you look at political theory, the closest thing to multi-stakeholderism is fascism. Fascism is as created by Mussolini. In other words, he talked about the fact that rather than having political parties and these sorts of things, people and society should be organized into groups. And these corporate groups should have representation within the parliament. Rather than geographic representation or other forms, he said business should have a seat at the table, labor should have a seat at the table, agriculture should have a seat at the table. And that seat at the table was articulated through the organizations that represented them. And indeed, the word fascist, it comes from an Italian word that refers to binding together. And the fascist symbol for Italy basically was a group of sticks all tied together and held in the hand of a strong leader. Okay? Nationalism, of course, developed as a very distinctive 19th and 20th century philosophy. And it pervades the internet. Many, many countries will make assertions of cyber sovereignty saying, we control our territory, we control our airspace, we control the water around us. Why don't we control cyberspace? Okay? And this is a huge debate within this community here. To what extent do countries, and how can countries assert authority over the internet? Marxism and communism, okay? These were political movements at that time that, Marxism, of course, you're well aware of, that talked about the role of societies and economies as being determined by who controlled the modes of production, and saw conflicts between different groups in that. They saw the transition between aristocracies and monarchies to the middle class or the industrial class as being the result of creation of new forms of production. And similarly, they forecast as capitalism began, because it squeezed basically the excess profits from the sweat of the workers, it would reach a roadblock, and there would be a worldwide proletariat or workers' revolution that would transform society back to Rousseau's state of nature. Very, very brief discussion of that. Another political movement, and I don't think people here, you need to think about it this way. Democracy is a political movement. Human rights is a political movement. It makes assertions about human beings that you may agree with, but do not necessarily show to have been the case in history, and may not necessarily be the case in the future. And that's kind of where this new concept of civil society came from. Civil society was not government. Civil society was not a strong political force to protect us all. Civil society kind of became the guardian of individual liberties, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. It kind of revolved around that, and somehow or other, democracy and human rights kind of were together, and civil society was transformed from basically an apology for authoritarian rule into kind of a discussion again that was kind of close to the Lockean notion of stakeholders. There's different stakeholders in the society that have different points of view, and they need to be represented. Okay, everybody following this? It's the first time I've done this lecture, and it needs to be smoothed out a bit, but and finally, where are we today? Okay, we've traversed from the 400 BC through the different political theories and movements in the 17th and 18th century. We looked at the 19th century and the 20th century. We're now at something that some people call the end of ideology. That we no longer have these kind of deep political beliefs or systems. Right now, some people will say that there's been a triumph. 10 years ago, if I had said this, everybody would have nodded, that's right. No more totalitarian states. And indeed, if you look at the 20th century, and you look at the struggles against both the Nazis, the Japanese, and the Russian state, indeed, democratic societies, the West as it was called, prevailed over these societies that rejected a lot of the values that we thought were important in our societies. At the same time, though, we've had a very interesting development in China. I would assert that, we've had a reemergence of the Confucian state. And in fact, I think many of you, in talking with you, I've remarked that the Northeast Asian countries, Japan, Korea, China, are remarkably similar in terms of the way in which their societies function. The strength of the administrative culture, the emphasis on groups, a respect for human rights, but understanding that human rights need to be understood within a community context, the respect for education and order and hierarchy. They're all aspects of this Confucian state. And it's a very, very different ideology, because that's what it is. What's an ideology? An ideology helps you to organize different facts about politics into kind of a coherent story. Doesn't mean it's the right story, but it helps you to think about it in a coherent story. So Confucianism is kind of a story about how societies should be organized. And it's not the same as democracy, which is also a story about how society should be organized. Why did I put the EU up here? Because basically, the EU is an ideology as well. Because basically, Europe is the place where the nation state, the idea of nationalism, first emerged. And the EU is trying to transcend and transform nationalism. And right now, and if I'd spoken to you 4 or 5 years ago, everybody would say, yeah, and it was working. And now you're going, yeah, it's not working, is it? Okay? But it is, you know, if you live in Europe, as I did for many, many years and worked on EU affairs, EU is an ideology. It permeates everything. In fact, the rejection of the EU in Britain, in many ways, was founded by this deep, deep distrust of this European Leviathan. Remember Thomas Hobbes? You know? And a lot of the fear was expressed, how can a country like UK in a large world survive without being part of Europe? So Hobbesian logic was driving at some point a lot of the discussion about Brexit. I haven't gotten Adam to look up yet and say, really? Not yet. But on the other hand, if we're talking about the end of ideology, where do we put these guys? Al-Qaeda, Taliban, the ISIS? Religious extremism. Okay? That's a new ideology. It's a new way of organizing society, the caliphate. And so, you know, when we casually talk about democratic values, what are we talking about? And who are we talking to besides ourselves? Yeah, democracy beat, you know, communism. Communism may be dead, but the Russian state isn't dead. China may have been transformed, but it's not transformed in ways that would lead you to this notion. You remember there was a developmental notion that as societies became more prosperous and grew, they became more democratic. Boy, it ain't working here. And, you know, this question of whether regional organizations, regional integration, even though they're dictated very strongly by economics, or by the internet, by the way, whether they can beat nationalism. Right now, nationalism is on the uprise just as religious extremism is. And if you ignore that stuff in thinking about the internet, you're not going to get very far with anybody. You may be able to talk to yourselves about it, but you're ignoring the rest of the world. Okay. All right. I'm going to just almost finish with these definitions. The final one, there's a lot, you know, Kilnam and I argue about this, a lot of confusion about what we're talking about now. I think, you know, the internet, distributed network of networks that offers ubiquitous, nobody's going to argue with that. I think that's the definition of the internet as a technology. But the impact of the internet on our economy, our society, and politics is much more summed up in this. Digital economy is one based on digital technologies, including not only the ICT sector, but traditional economic sectors such as manufacturing. I think, and I'm going to give you the conclusion before we finish, I think talking about internet governance is talking about that first part. I mean, that's what John Postal and all these guys were doing, you know, assigning the IP numbers and ICANN and all this kind of stuff. That's what that's all about. But that doesn't have a lot to do with this. And so to say that that this group or any group or ICANN or IGF is going to organize and manage the digital economy is, I think, just, a misconception of enormous dimensions. It just shows incredible conceptual confusion. It's not unreasonable in the sense that the internet developed because a group of professors in the United States with defense agency money decided to connect supercomputers and send emails to each other. And at that level, that's fine. And then, organized as that cute little thing from Vince Cerf showed, a little post office mailing system. But that's not what's going on here when the automobile industry is going to be transformed, when healthcare delivery is going to be changed fundamentally, when education is going to be turned on its head, when manufacturing, none of you are going to have jobs, or at least the jobs that you're thinking of. I tell my students, you're wasting your time in the classroom if you're preparing for jobs in this century, because the internet and the digital economy have arrived, and they're going to fundamentally upend your lives over the next 10 to 20 years. You're going to have to be very, very flexible. Okay. All right. Now, there was a great quote that Adam put up. Here's another great quote about politics. This is by this guy, John Perry Barlow. I never met him. Governments of the industrial world. Very dramatic. It's almost written in Hobbesian language. That's the way Hobbes used to write. You weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. This is the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, 20 years ago. And I'm telling you, and it'll be the first question, it's over, folks. It's over. Okay? But I will ask that, I will throw that out for discussion. But I hear so many echoes of this in every document written about internet governance. And so many assumptions that are brought to the discussion. I mean, I think almost everybody would agree this is absurd right now. But some of the documents recently published, some of those WSIS documents and things like that, may actually read the same way 10 or 15 years from now. Certainly, if you read George Bush's speeches about the Middle East and what he was going to accomplish by the Iraq War 12 years later, they don't read really well. They don't read really well. If you go into a problem with a mistaken set of assumptions and you actually act on them, you can create a real mess. Or you can create Donald Trump. Trump is a direct result of some of these decisions that were made during the Bush administration. I'm glad I'm on video. Okay, so now we're going to start the discussions. Just a quick show of hands. Did Barlow get it right, or is he just naive? How many people think he got it right? Okay, good, good. If you guys hadn't raised your hands, I would have asked you to raise your hands. I'm not going to ask the other question. But let me ask this related question. I'll ask it to Jeremy. I'm not going to ask you the first part, because we actually got that from Adam. That's good. But is the internet space today more or less free from government intervention? I mean, Barlow was speaking at a time when it was still being operated out of John Postel's mailbox, right? Jeremy?
It's definitely more, there's more government intervention, and the government has belatedly caught on to the fact that this network was being run by a bunch of geeks, and and things that used to be taken for granted by the internet community as being their responsibility have been taken up as government responsibilities. For example, one of the turning points, I think, was when the governments declared national sovereignty over their CCTLDs. They said that .au is the national property of Australia, whereas before it was just John Postel delegated it to this guy Robert Ells, who ran out of the University of Melbourne, and it was just a service of his to the internet community. But suddenly, it's actually a national property, just like the ground that we walk on. And the same thing where we've had court judgments recently where a court will order a company like Google to block content across the whole world. They feel that they have, a national jurisdiction over the entire internet, which is kind of ridiculous. But since there's this clash between these overlapping national jurisdictions and the way the internet works, we need to figure out a better way to coordinate, and that's what internet governance is really all about, I guess, right now.
Yeah, I was, and I was really, really intrigued by what Jeremy said and the way he formulated it about the role of internet governance. He said, with respect to national governments, we understand that we're not going to make a lot of progress telling them what they can do or not do within their national territories. But the internet technology intrinsically is something that's transnational, and therefore requires different mechanisms, different institutions for managing it. That is a powerful, powerful argument. But I think it's one that we really need to unpeel a little bit. I'm going to try to do that through the subsequent discussion questions. Adam?
Yeah, I think Barlow was both a visionary and naive, and that's pretty apparent. I think if you put it in the context of the time, in 1996, the Clinton administration was just beginning to formulate its policies on e-commerce, as it was then. E-commerce became the digital economy of today, and what they were basically saying was that government should take a step back. And this was also part of a sort of trend of an introduction of self-regulation, particularly within the communication space, where you'd seen the beginnings of privatizations of almost every telecommunication company across the globe, beginning in 1984, but by 1996, trade agreements in the WTO and so on and so forth were liberalizing telecommunications and communications. So the Clinton administration was basically saying governments generally should have a very hands-off role on the emergence of this new, what we were beginning to think of as a new industrial, quote, revolution. So I think in many ways, Barlow was sort of mirroring that, but he was also doing it from a very libertarian and somewhat Republican and somewhat hippie, because he was the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, a very famous group from San Francisco. But, and at the same time, that same Clinton administration was saying the core functions of the internet, the Postel notebook of what what has become ICANN and so on, that should be internationalized. That was in the 1997 statements from the Clinton administration about e-commerce, was that these processes that had come out of the Department of Defense funded programs should be internationalized and given over to sort of a global community, because they weren't the responsibility of any single government. So he was sort of right and wrong and naive and, time of change.
Well, we're going to take this a step farther. I hope this is my next slide. I can't remember. Yeah, there it is. It's perfect. Okay. So I don't think any of you ever thought you'd get a question like this, but I'd like to get some...
Are we throwing a question for discussion one?
Huh? Pardon?
We had one discussion one, and are you finished through?
No, that's just question number 2.
So you move, so we don't discuss one anymore.
No. I want to go back. We'll come back, because these questions all come together. But let me throw this question to you, Kilnam. Well, okay. Yeah, well, this will be fun. If we look at internet governance today, does Aristotle's typology make any sense? Remember, he talked about monarchy, aristocracy, polity versus tyranny, oligarchy, and the rule of all. So, if you wanted to locate different players or different organizations within this typology, where would you put them? And to give you an example, and why what Adam said fits in so nicely. The U.S. was doing many of the things that they were doing through the 90s, and indeed even connected now to some of the policy positions that you see coming out of the U.S., because they were the monarch. They owned the internet. And everybody accepted the fact that U.S. leadership, both because of their technology, but also because of the openness and democracy associated with their system, that was fine. It was best. In fact, Aristotle argued that the best form of government was an enlightened monarch. You put a smart, benevolent person at the top, not a dictator, somebody who seized power, but somebody who was legitimated through it. And U.S. was legitimated because U.S. created the technology, and they created the companies, and they were willing to spend the resources necessary to maintain the system. So, yeah, that's why Clinton could do these kinds of things, because it only reinforced U.S. hegemony, U.S. leadership, the monarchy. Okay, what about, where would you put the IETF in this typology? Anybody? Come on. Scratching your head. Why don't you, huh? Jeremy?
Aristocracy.
That's right. Whoa, see, now you got it. You know, who are these guys? You know, they're kind of, you know, the enablers. The guys who rode with the monarch and won the battles and legitimated themselves because they were the people that actually built, created, and sustained the internet. And I think one of the tragedies today, and you have to ask yourself, is they still consider themselves the aristocracy. And, you know, given the fact that the internet has become a mass society in some respects, that's another concept from sociology. I mean, are they any more relevant? I mean, you know, they're former aristocrats in China, they're former aristocrats in Japan, there's former aristocrats in Korea, but they're totally irrelevant. The societies have swept past them. Has that happened with the IETF? I'm just throwing that out, just a way of thinking about it. Okay, what about ICANN? You can't say anything, Adam. What is ICANN? Now, clearly we've used up two of them, so it's not a monarch and it's not an aristocracy.
Tyranny? Oh, sorry.
Tyranny. Huh? Anybody? Come on. Raise your hands, Grace. Any ideas? Yes. Huh? Which, what? Okay. I would put, we're going to jump a little bit. Social media. Into rule of law. In the sense that it's almost Twitter, Facebook, some of these other things. It's almost like mob rule. Rule of all means rule by no one. And when you see the enormous influence that social media has had in governing us, those of you who have your news feeds on Facebook or on Twitter, I mean, in many ways, the information you receive is the information that confirms what you already believe. Okay? So, social media, in some cases, can come close to, and it's very interesting too, isn't it? Because social media doesn't have anything to do with national borders. You've got 1 billion people looking at some of this stuff. Okay? And that is changing, and we'll talk about this later. This is changing the way the world is going to be organized. Okay? But we're going to leap to that a little bit later. Okay, I would put ICANN into oligarchy. All right, and that's a bit of a stretch, but you have a certain self-perpetuating elite that are involved with that, and also there's huge amounts of money involved with the operations and kind of changes with respect to oligarchy. People can argue about these are just things, suggested sorts of frameworks. China. Where would you put China in terms of this, in terms of its role on the internet?
Can we go back a second?
Yeah.
You don't think that ICANN is an attempt at creating this polity idea of an organized society with its own constitution and organizational methods, and sort of like creating a new structure that is different from... I don't think it's fair to say it's an oligarchy, although I see what you mean.
Well, no. I was actually doing that to be provocative. I'll give you a secret.
Couldn't it be a monarchy?
These things are organized
They are.
in the same way.
Which is governing.
The right answers are organized in the same order. Okay, yeah. ICANN is the polity. China is the tyranny. Google has aspects of an oligarchy. And social media, the rule of all. Okay? I do want to move on. We can argue about these things, but it does help you a little bit just to think about these things in that particular context. And you can argue that, aristocracy, monarchy abused changes into tyranny. Aristocracy abused changes into oligarchy. Polities that are bankrupt, that no longer organize opinion in a society through elites that are devoted to representing those, deteriorate into the rule of all. Okay? There was a systematic taxonomy of how this is organized. Okay, let me just jump a little bit then. So, if we take Hobbes and we look at the internet, is the internet, if Hobbes were alive today, would he be writing about the internet as he wrote about the situation at the end of the Civil War in England? That the greatest threat to the internet is anarchy? That, right now, nobody seems to be able to impose order on the internet. And not only because the organizations such as IETF and ICANN are losing their leadership and their ability to control events, but because technology is just leaping over them. And governments have diverse agendas. Companies are becoming bigger than countries. Individuals now, through social media, are empowered to address the world. So, do we need a Leviathan? Do we need somebody to be in charge?
No.
No.
Okay. Anarchy's fine?
No, I don't think go to the anarchy.
Huh?
No, you won't go to the anarchy.
Yeah,
Okay, so you don't think we have anarchy now?
it's not anarchy. No,
Okay.
people can communicate with the world. That's a plus point. That can be looked at it from various points.
Okay. All right, well, let's jump then to the third question. Is the internet most free when there are no rules? Does Rousseau have it right?
Yes.
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 Okay, what about the danger of the general will? When things break down, what happens? Yeah.
I would say no, actually, to that last thing, because there's no such thing as no rules. Like, if you think there's no rules, that just really means that the people who have power are silently making rules that you have no say in. So, the Googles and the Chinas and the US, there's still rules there,
Right.
even though you don't see them.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, there are always rules. Okay? So the idea that there's no rules is kind of an oxymoron, fundamentally contradictory. There's always rules, you just have to understand what the rules are. Yeah, Adam?
I was going to say that I don't think we're anywhere near approaching anarchy. I think we're approaching the opposite, which is control. That the world is being, the internet world is being increasingly controlled by a Facebook, which governs how we will represent ourselves and present our interests and present our points of view in a very strange and ordered kind of uniform, globally uniform sort of structure. You know, we're all going to write within that particular set of boxes and communicate in that way. We're going to start receiving our news in that way. Was it 40% of US citizens get their daily news through Facebook, and the algorithms and the sorting functions that presents? That's not anarchy. That's one organization representing exactly how we're going to see the world. A lot of our world is dictated through Google and the way that we use search.
Okay, then answer that first question then in this new slide. Sounds like you're a Marxist.
Absolutely, because I believe in. I mean, one of the greatest things that the internet has given us is this notion of permissionless innovation, which is probably not a Marxist statement.
Okay, but who owns the means of production on the internet? You're telling me that Facebook does.
I'm saying that they don't necessarily own it, but they're certainly sort of controlling it. I wouldn't want to put ownership
Okay.
on it.
Well, I mean,
because we do have the opportunity to choose to change. So,
but do we?
Well, we can, but we don't. Because we're lazy and we're human beings and we all like the idea of having lots of friends that we don't actually have.
Okay, well, how about that second question? Anybody else want to tackle that? As the internet shifts the economic basis of society, we're talking about a digital economy, guys. I mean, it ain't going to be the way it is. Fundamentally transformed. Whether it's the insurance industry or banking or education. I mean, the idea of holding a conference like this 20 years from now will be like, you know, John Postal's email sorting operation. It's going to change fundamentally. And is that going to change the integrity and stability of existing political institutions? And you say, well, I don't know. Well, look what's happening in the role of social media and the social media candidate that has emerged in the United States. He's swept by traditional gatekeepers. That's what polities are about. Polities mean you have elites that are ahead of institutions that control participation. And control isn't bad, because when there are no controls, what do you have? You have the rule of all. That's anarchy. And so what's happened with social media, other sorts of things that connect people instantaneously, it's wonderful, but at the same time the gatekeepers go away. In the United States, the political parties are no longer the gatekeepers to the presidency. The media is no longer the gatekeepers to the presidency. Labor unions are no longer the gatekeepers to the presidency. Agricultural federations are no longer the gatekeepers to the presidency. It's all about, we're going to build a wall. And we're going to bar people from the United States that we don't like. And it changes. And it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It changes every day. So, what does that mean for our political institutions? People are seriously asking that in the United States right now. Very seriously. I mean, we talked about the internet as being very functional for democracy in the 2008 and 2012 campaigns Obama ran. 2008, he used the campaigns basically to raise money from a lot of individuals. In other words, reducing the role of big money in politics. And he also very effectively used it to organize volunteers to go out and begin to bring new voters into the political system. That's why he got enormous support, incredible support from young people and minorities. Those people don't usually vote. Okay? So internet was looked upon as very functional. Now, some of the more dysfunctional aspects of it are coming out. Okay. You know, when we start debating, as Adam was doing, about regulation of the internet, I don't think we realize that we're actually just having the same debate that classical and modern liberal parties have. In other words, is it better to leave it alone? Or are there certain things that need to be protected collectively in the interests of society? Okay? And in that particular context, whether it's privacy, or certain standards for security, or competition, or ways in which standards are made or unmade. All those things, questions with respect to the way in which content is provided or not provided on the internet, questions with respect to how filtering operates. All of those things are related to this debate between classic and modern liberalism. And you kind of come down then, you jump a bit, because we're having an argument in many ways. We're having this argument here in this room, but we haven't had put the correct labels on it. The labels I think we're talking about is digital economy and digital society. And digital society is a lot of the human values that we think need to be protected and strengthened on the internet. And digital economy is all about this transformation of the way in which we organize our work life, whether it's taxi service or the way we buy books. I mean, think about it. The way we buy books has been transformed. Nobody even thinks about that anymore. I thought it was so great when you could order a book. It's so great now with grocery shopping in Japan. I can order groceries and they're delivered to my house in an hour. I live in a big city, but... So what we're really arguing about is this conflict, I think, between digital economy and digital society. And the question I think we need to ask ourselves is, can we have both?
Tough.
It's tough. It's tough. And your definition of a digital society and my definition of a digital society may be different. And that makes it really tough, particularly when we try to go international on this thing. It's a tough enough debate within each culture and each language group and each society to decide on what are our core values and how do we deal with them. But then the problem is that this thing is inherently global and this thing is inherently local. You got that difference? Local, global. And it's very, very difficult to bridge that kind of gap. That's, I think, the challenge that we really, really have. Okay, political scientists, this is just a further question, but it gets down to this question of, Aristotle argued this in terms of polity. Political scientists today, whether you're looking at, when you're looking at democracies that are dysfunctional, and increasingly the U.S. is becoming dysfunctional, it's when, elites begin to no longer control the gateways to power. And they're no longer able to control their constituencies. And so, societies run by elites, democrat values can best be preserved by promoting competition among the elites. In other words, the issue is not widespread, open, participatory democracy. It gets to what Jeremy was talking about, deliberative democracy. In other words, this competition, discussion among elites that are responsible to their constituencies. And the question is this insight relevant to the problem of internet governance? And I would argue it is. My problem, and I think all of our problems with the multi-stakeholder system, is not that having participation from different stakeholder groups is not something that we should support. It makes sense because the internet is incredibly diverse, and particularly when, like it or not, we're going to have to bridge the gap between the digital society and the digital economy. But the question is, how do we make a system where elites are responsible and can actually represent their constituencies? How do we institutionalize those relationships? I mean, my biggest problem with the IGF is that anyone can come. That's a formula for the rule of law and anarchy, or at least boredom, as you're listening to one thing after another. Unless you structure participation, you're not going to get outcomes that make sense. I think that's a fundamental principle of political science. That's what we're talking about. How do you create elites that are responsible and responsive to their constituencies, and how do you create institutions that allow the concerns and wishes of constituencies be carried in a structured sort of way to places where decisions are made. Now, we've solved that, and I'll get to your question. We've solved that, as Jeremy said, in some cases, in some countries at the national level. The problem is, as Jeremy's identified, we haven't figured out how to do that at the international level. And I think that's where we're coming really to the crux of the issue, whether that can be done. Yeah, the question?
Yeah, would that create discrimination? Because if there are only people who some of the, like the people in power want, then that would probably be something like, only the people who are in the dialogue or lobbying the issues would be there. So it would be something very controlled.
Well, I agree. I should have had another slide here because, there's a very famous novel written by George Orwell where he described he was describing the Russian Revolution, but he made a parody of it and talked about a revolution on a farm where the animals took over from the farmer. And the animals, when they first took over, all were working together and such like that. But the nature of the human condition, and this is what Aristotle also said, but we didn't get into it, people are different and people are fundamentally unequal. And human beings only work and exist in hierarchical relationships. Yes, you can point to me groups where people are relatively equal, but almost inevitably hierarchy develops, only because people bring different talents, different experiences. If we didn't have diversity, it'd be a very boring place. So to insist that everybody have an equal say, to insist that everybody, have an opportunity to participate, while that can be an ideal, practically we have to kind of sort it out in some sort of way. And that also poses huge problems, because the famous phrase from that book, the pig was the political commissar. Of course, the pig, and of course he was a pig because Orwell had observed that political people in Russia ate better than anybody else. And the pig made the very, very important observation, on our farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Okay? In other words, some people are in charge and some people aren't. There's a lot of different ways to deal with inequality, to deal with differences in power relationships. We use institutions for doing that. We have periodic ways through courts and other mechanisms to change elites. But fundamentally, the human condition, I think, leaves us quite short of what Rousseau talked about. Remember, we're getting back to Rousseau, because that's a very Rousseauian statement. The state of nature, we're all equal and we're all provided for. It's just not the case. This is a further discussion question, but it leaps down to this other issue here. We find, and I mentioned this at the beginning, that a person's political identification with politics is mediated principally through families, schools, peer groups, mass media, governments. As I said, if I can have a few basic data points with you, I can probably tell you how you think on a whole variety of issues. A lot of what you're doing is conditioned behavior. It's conditioned by what your dad said, it's conditioned by what your buddies say, it's conditioned by your work experiences. There's nothing unusual about that. But, and that's what Google's all about, right? They make assumptions about you based on your behavior. And you think that, you're inside yourself. And so you kind of think that, well, I'm doing all these things because it's internally determined. But actually, most of what you're thinking and doing, even your consciousness of yourself, your ability to say, I'm different than that other person, is conditioned by the fact that you are making comparisons from external references. So, and I've touched on this again, and I kind of just like a few comments. Is the pervasiveness and social media and related mobile applications changing this dynamic? And I'd like to ask you, because I was talking to Amrita before, and I said, people my age became people, in other words, we matured, developed our own personalities before the internet started. And therefore, my dad, my school, my peer group made a huge difference. I'm just wondering, for those of you younger people, I mean, your mom and dad are Facebook, your buddies are Facebook. How much of social media is determining your personality and your way of viewing and understanding the world and its problems? I would argue that you're going to see, and I know I'll get everybody annoyed with me, I think civil society, at least as civil society is defined by this group, is going to be going through a generational change. I think the people that originally became involved are going to be passing from the scene, and people that grew up in the internet world are suddenly going to come to the fore. And I really wonder what you're thinking. Anybody want to jump in and tell me what you're thinking? Kashri?
I'm confused.
You're confused, okay. How are you confused?
Yeah, there are several things going on in my mind. I'm just trying to relate some of the things to the sort of like the governing structures that you
Yeah.
mentioned initially, and then these questions.
I mean,
are-
but I guess the question is, you know, how much time a day do you spend on the internet?
almost sort of like
Yeah, and all your buddies are on the internet, right?
yeah.
And you share their lives through the internet. Okay? Do you think that's making, how is that, does that change your relationship to politics or to society?
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
It has definitely.
Yeah.
Because when I compare my sort of like early youth age, I was more sorry. So when I just sort of like compare my today with the early youth ages, so I used to be very active in this communist political party. Used to lead their youth wing. That was more sort of like hands-on political movement and stuff. And now what I do on Facebook and sort of like relate to different ideologies coming up there, so I feel myself totally different from what I was there in my college life or wherever. Yeah. So it has shaped up a lot over the period of time. So it took like 10 years maybe, but what I am right now is completely different from what I used to be in my college. So.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I think that the technology is going to change people. Going to change people. And that's going to have an enormous impact. I mean, for example, Emily, I'll give it to you in just a second. I mean, people in the United States right now, the political pundits, the opinion leaders, can't understand where Donald Trump's support is coming from. They don't, it's not that these kind of tendencies didn't exist in American society all along, but people didn't express them. People didn't act on them. People were not able to affect political events through them. Suddenly, it's kind of just emerged. And it is a phenomenon of social media. And people are being torn out of their family, their school, their peer groups. You can't use traditional polling methods anymore to know how somebody is going to vote. You still find, well, if you're uneducated and white and live in rural America, you're supporting Trump. I'm not sure that that's why they're supporting Trump. There's something more there. And that's why, if it was only uneducated, white, rural America, you wouldn't win the election. Okay? And yet right now, it's very much a toss-up. Well,
Yeah, I have a comment as well as a question. So probably I'll start with the comment. So I think, Jim, I think you mentioned earlier, like social media has enormous impact on our life. So we have been kind of brainwashed with something which we idealize. I mean, in general. So for example, you gave an example of Twitter. So we follow a certain ideology which we already believe, I mean, deep in our earth. So I mean, I think this is like contradictory to what you just said, that okay, when you, I mean, have a lot of things going on, so you don't have a parent, Facebook is your parent. So I mean, don't you think there's a contradiction here where you said we will only follow somebody who we feel is worth it, or probably be a friend. So I mean, there's some conflict here. That's what I want to raise. And one thing is, I mean, I also wanted to understand the worst effect of this pervasiveness. So I think we all in this room acknowledge the fact that it's being more pervasive. So I mean, organizations like Google know about us more than we know ourselves. I mean, to some extent, because they have a certain assumptions about our behavior. So probably, I mean, going forward, elections will be predicted. So people will know before the election happens who is going to win. Through the pervasive nature of the, I mean, whole electorate. So what could be the worst?
We're going to put you in jail because I predict that you're going to,
Yeah,
do something bad.
Yeah. So what could be the other worst effects of these?
Well, I mean, but rather than speculating on that, I just want to throw this out because I know that a lot of what I'm saying isn't necessarily all that coherent and consistent, but I don't think it's a lot of things are just happening. And I think that too much of the debate on internet governance, and we're getting back to that, aren't we, has been a little bit sterile. It's kind of been debating the old issues and not understanding that the broader political and social and economic systems have already turned the corner and are moving down this expressway very, 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 very fast. And I'm not quite sure where the younger generation is on this. I've got two daughters, one 26 and one 32, and they're really different. I mean, one's a lawyer, one's in business school, but they think really differently than I do. And they're connected in ways that are very, very different. And their ideas are shaped by peer groups that are more diverse and larger than any I could ever have imagined. And that's important. And so, now a lot of people said, and we got a little bit of time. The second question is really interesting. The question is, does the internet lead to political change? Now, I talked a lot about the US presidential election, but if you remember, everybody was so excited and enthusiastic, in the 2013-14 period, during the Arab Spring. I was teaching a internet policy class at Kale. We followed that umbrella revolution in Hong Kong real time. And they were using, what was it? It was Fire Chat or something, a near frequency thing, so they could speak to each other without having the Chinese police pick up their transmissions. Very much internet driven, okay? But what did we learn? What did Egypt do at the height of their Arab Spring? Government pulled the cord on the internet. What did the Iranians do during the Green Revolution? They had a few nervous moments, but they collected all the emails and chat and information, and they rounded up people, and they had evidence. People said, I didn't do that. What is this email? Government surveillance was pervasive. The umbrella revolution, the notion was that the Chinese government would have to tread carefully, and they did tread carefully. They dealt with it fundamentally peacefully, but that this revolution was going to succeed because the eyes of the world were upon it. But you know what? It didn't matter. After a certain period of time, consistent with their own political objectives, the Chinese authorities shut it down. Okay? And it does leave you with that kind of sick feeling. That sick feeling. The notion is that the internet, and Hillary Clinton gave a very famous speech in 2010, talked about internet freedom and access and how it was going to change the world and how democracies around the world had to unify and create technologies that allowed people to communicate even around, firewalls and government attempts to block and deny them access to the internet. But you know what we're seeing, and this is just a conundrum, I just want to throw it out to you, that it seems that authoritarian governments can manage the internet a lot better than democracies. Did you ever think about that? A little paradox there, isn't it? I mean, social media is very pernicious and dangerous in democracy, because democracy actually depends upon the free flow of information. But is social media the free flow of information? Or is it full of falsehoods and assumptions and hatreds and innuendos and issues that destroy at least the reliability of information and the ability of a democratic society to communicate effectively among themselves, and the ability of elites, because, you know, all of you are elites, don't kid yourself, okay? Don't say, oh, we're common people. You're not. You're elites. That's why you're here. And elites have a role in societies. Aristotle says it's the best society because they structure participation. And structuring participation also requires structuring information, because information and data are now basically what runs and changes and moves our societies. So you could argue that authoritarian governments do a much better job of that. I don't want to go into, I lecture extensively about situations in China and things like that. The Chinese have done a very, very good job in some respect, consistent with their values. I mean, Chinese say and it's not contestable. They say that people are allowed to have their opinions and to express their views, but they have to be consistent too with principles of social harmony. That gets back to that Confucian ethic. Okay? It's a different way of organizing society. And it comes from a very, very different cultural and historical tradition. And the internet, and that's the interesting thing, that's why Hillary Clinton in the 2010 speech was wrong. The internet is not inconsistent with a non-undemocratic society. That's one of the things we've got to realize. And so the notion of internet governance as being fundamentally participatory and, you know, everybody having their say is kind of sort of a reflection of a particular cultural and social and historical context. I don't think it necessarily determines what happens with the internet more broadly. And clearly, if you look at the Arab Spring, the Umbrella Revolution, the US presidential election, the internet is kind of a fickle friend for democracy. Okay. Good. This worked out. We got 10 minutes left. Let me just finish this, and then I'll take your question. Just 10 minutes left. As I said, this is the first time I've... Yes?
It's a joke regarding the Arab Spring.
Yes. Yeah.
After the fall of the Tunisian president, Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali, in Jordan we had a joke. Why do the Tunisian youth demonstrate in the streets? Don't they have the Facebook?
Now, each of these revolutions was very, very different. Tunisia, Egypt, what happened elsewhere. But, okay. So this is like the bottom line here. All right? Thank you for being so patient. This last slide. Politics is fundamentally about legitimacy. Okay? That's why monarchs are legitimate, just like parliaments are legitimate. There are very many different forms of legitimacy. The Communist Party, in its history, provides legitimacy to the Beijing leadership. The emperor provides a certain amount of legitimacy to the Japanese parliamentary government. Okay? The Constitution provides legitimacy to the U.S. government. It's about sovereignty. Okay? Who is in charge and what powers do they have? And what's the biggest power that a government has? A government has a power to put you in jail. A government has a power to kill you. A government has a military to enforce its rule and seize your property. They have, sovereignty means that they have the monopoly of power. Okay? Don't kid yourself. That's what it's about. Okay? And in the United States, there are many people say, oh, the government can't do this to me. I said, don't pay your taxes. See what happens. You'll come out your front door one day and the Internal Revenue Service is hauling away your car. And you go to the bank and they've frozen your bank accounts. And you go to use your credit cards and they filed a report with your credit card company. You're toast. Okay? There's a lot of ways that government can impact upon your lives rather than throw you in jail. And then authority. And authority is that mixture of sovereignty, the ability to enforce your orders, and legitimacy. Many people kind of refer to it as the rule of law, or having a common set of expectations of what government can do and what they shouldn't do. And the story of the last 1,000 years, globally, has been the collapse of empires and the emergence of nation-states based on territory, language, cultural, historical affinity. You saw that first in Europe. You saw it later with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which basically unleashed a lot of the continuing turmoil in the Middle East. And then you saw it with the end of colonialism and the impact of World War II on all these countries across the Asia-Pacific region. And now we have, I don't know how many, 160, 170 countries around the world, part of the UN. And they, everybody insists that they control their territory. They're very insistent about their language, and they have a certain cultural and historical affinity. So, now the question comes, and this is, where we end up. And it actually comes back to Jeremy's very interesting observation. We got a problem right now. And the problem is, we've got a technology that's, its scale and ubiquity appears to present a direct challenge to the integrity and continued relevance of the nation-state model. Who thinks that the country of France will not be around 50 years from now? Well, I mean, don't kind of just say that. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can happen. I mean, 50, 60 years ago, France was occupied by the Germans, and at least as an independent state, briefly ceased to exist. So yeah, nation states and borders and everything do change, but I guess all of us, what you're really telling me is that you think that the way we organize ourselves politically, based on nation states that control territory, that have a common language, have a cultural and historical affinity for each other, that will continue. Well, I spent 3 years in Brussels as the deputy chief and sometimes ambassador of the United States to the European Union. And I used to travel around, and I met with European students and things like that. And this was kind of at the height of the European Union, in 2003, 2004. They had just introduced the common currency, a lot of very, very progressive things being done. I asked them to raise their hand. How many the young Europeans in the room, I asked, how many of them think that they're Europeans, or how many think that they're Hungarians or British or Germans? And it was very surprising that generally about 30 or 40% of the people in the room thought they were Europeans. Now that may have decreased a bit with all the things that happened over the last 10 years. But the fact is that there was a powerful integrative effect going on in Europe. I'm just wondering with this young generation here, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. You guys have been raised on the internet. You tell me that the internet is transnational, that it's borderless, that it's ubiquitous, that it offers connectivity, that it's changing the way you think. How many of you think of yourselves as Asians? Okay. All right. Well, that's not bad. Can you tell me why? Now, let me ask, I'm sorry, what nationality are you?
Thai.
Okay. Everybody that raised their hand, if you could come up and stand behind the mic, because this is the way I want to end it. I think this is fascinating. So if you raised your hand, come up and tell us why. Please.
Hi, I'm TikTok from Thailand. The reason that I'm considering myself Asians because actually I'm not sure about the real definition of Asian. because we are like a huge like continent. But because I grew up in Thailand, I born and raised in Thailand, and culturally, like I was raised with this kind of like the thinking and culture that like make me think that we really different from the West, from the Westerns, and or even like from the like other continents in the world. So like I cannot, my English is not good, so maybe I cannot like tell you more about the detail about like what difference between like Asians and
does
other
the
parts.
internet have any impact on that?
The internet.
Do you have a lot of friends in, say, Vietnam or in Cambodia or in Philippines that you talk to?
Yes, I also have like Western friends, like classmates also, but I don't think that have like changed the way I think or I see the world that much. I mean, I've been like maybe like
Well, what media? What media do you read? Do you always read Thai media, or do you read? What do you read? What newspaper do you read?
Both actually, economists also, and
Okay.
also like in Thai.
So you're
newspaper.
European then?
No, I don't. Maybe because of my educational background. Yeah, but
Well, you know, though, I mean, one of the most persuasive things about the internet is that you are what you read and think, or read and see. So if you're reading mostly Western media, does reading the Western media emphasize that you're more Asian?
yeah.
Okay.
And I suppose because I'm not from Bangkok, I grew up in like rural area, and I spent like a decade in Bangkok before. But I after a decade in Bangkok, I realized that I really hate it. I really hate the way that like the city people view the world or something. I just want to go back to like rural, and then like so when I met like international friends or something, and they have this kind of view. It doesn't mean like I don't like them, but it's like I not really agree for what everything they say. Like sometimes like some I even like this discussions or even like this presentation. Sometimes I think of it like it's kind of like Western viewpoint of view. Yeah, it doesn't represent everything in like the whole picture or something like that. Because of my from the area that I'm from, I'm working now. Yeah, social medias have like influence that have some like impact on like the way people think and consume the media also. Like my grandmother or something, but like they use Line. I'm not sure if you know Line. It's kind of like WhatsApp, but it's popular like chatting app in Thailand. But still, when I want to communicate with the community, we still need some kind of like really what to call like the public speaker, like the radio signal is way better than calling them or using Line to inform them. Yeah, so it's still happening now in 2016 in some many part of Thailand. But if in Bangkok, it doesn't work because when I'm in Bangkok, I don't listen to radio. I use internet, I use Twitter and Facebook. Yeah, but in the rural, if you want to communicate with people, like you have some kind of like official statement to inform the head of the villager or something, it's better to use telephone to call them or like have like this like public radio or something. It's better than using like Twitter or Facebook. Yeah. So that's why that's why I consider myself like Asian or Thai, maybe because of some geographical background and cultural background.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mahesh, I'm going to give you the last word here, but you know.
Perfect. Thank you. There were two others who were supposed to.
I want to speak. I just want to speak.
But wouldn't the Asian
Come on up.
Wouldn't the
Come on up.
Asian come later than American context?
He's keeping us to lunch. It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm an Asian because I have the values of being an Asian, and apart from that, looking at my community, people, there's a lot of things that is happening, especially in Asia. When you talk about connecting the next billion, I think it's coming from Asia. It will be Asia. Asia is rising, and I think it's basically the values that we have. I think those are the more intricate factors that differentiate you from who or what you are. in context of internet, you talked about how internet is currently changing the next coming generation. But I strongly believe and say it's not because of the internet. It's not because of the internet. You are different from your parent. You are completely different. It's not because of the internet. Internet was not even then there. I am like this, because it's like the things that has happened to me. Internet is something so radical, so dynamic, that it has changed us in so many ways. But it doesn't define the core values within us. Humanity, all those values that we have, the respect, the things that we have, it comes from what we see, what we share. So, for me, I come from Nepal, and during, recently we had an earthquake. For me, internet changed. The definition changed. It completely changed in terms of, I started, at that time when the earthquake happened, we were isolated. No technology, no nothing, right? There was a lot of outcry, a lot of, people were suffering, and out of the blues, internet was there, right? So people started communicating. People started sending us stuff. People started, they were like there. And that's how I, saw internet in a new way. Internet for me was humanity. I started communicating, getting stuff, arranged relief operations. So that was something so different. And I was like astounded in so many ways that how I could change people's life. And that was connecting the next billion, because someone from USA was, they were trying to connect. From India, people were coming in. From Brazil, they were like people. So it is more fascinating, we have to see the good part of it. We cannot just blame internet for everything, for the social change, for this and that. No, we humans are bound to change. Human evolution is, we have reached this stage because we are changeable. That is our values, that is our nature. We will not be stagnant. We will not stay with a definition of Aristotle. No. We will have our own definition. Somebody will come up and have a greater definition than that. That's how internet has evolved.
Okay, we're going to leave it at that, but I think I've proven my point. The generation is different. It's different, and I like that. I like it a lot. Mahesh, and then we'll close.
Actually, thank you, Jim, for very provocative questions. It actually occurred to me when you were talking about authoritarian states, that actually it seems that in their guts, the authoritarian states where internet has not grown organically seem to be far more conscious of the danger to the institutions that internet poses.
That's right.
And you see now in many countries that I'm familiar with, one of the first things that happens is shutting down the internet. And in fact, especially in those countries that are struggling to expand access, it's precisely there where shutting down internet is the easiest, and is also considered the most tempting as well as the most effective way of controlling a whole lot of activity. So in some ways, the erosion of institutions that internet has caused in the developed world is of course a very serious issue, and that's the whole the emergence of Trump and all the rest of it. But I think the same problem or the same challenge, when seen from the perspective of the relatively unconnected part of the world, the unconnected to the internet part of the world, seems very different. And I think we're going to see a very, very unorthodox defense of institutions, which might in fact even be the defense of tyrannies itself. But we are going to see that also happening in the coming days. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much.